Hello friends, I would like to continue a series of educational videos where I will be covering most typical beginner mistakes in chess. In each video, I will cover a real game that was played by a beginner versus an experienced player, in which typical and very common errors are punished in an instructional way. In the following game, the player with the black pieces was rated 1300 on chess.com, and I myself was playing with the white pieces. I started with d4 and my opponent plays e6. So here, if I was to play e4, we have the opening that's called the French defense. However, I wanted to continue playing in the spirit of Queen's Gambit. So I play c4. Now that's the first moment when my opponent surprises me and plays h6. That's a move that breaks the opening principles. It doesn't develop a piece, it doesn't fight for the center. However, there is no tactical punishment. I cannot just win a pawn or piece because he moved h6. Instead, it's a long-term punishment that I will get. I'm playing e4 and have full control over the center. Right now, I can use many efficient squares in the center for my pieces where they're safe from most of the opponent's pawns. For him, he can neither use any of these squares because they're all controlled by my centralized pawns. Neither really his pieces are safe even on c6, d6 or f6, because at any moment I can play moves like e5 and d5 and kick away his pieces. So the reason why white is already much better is because I'll be able to use the centralized squares for my own pieces while his pieces are going to be in danger. Please take a moment also to notice that if I ever play a move like e5, I do not only restrict his pieces from coming to the center, but then I can also deploy my piece on a very nice centralized square like e4. For instance, if I have the knight on c3 and I push the pawn to e5 like in the red arrow, then I'm able to safely maintain my knight on e4, where it's going to be shielded by the pawns and opponent's pawns won't have an opportunity to kick it away. So after e4, my opponent plays knight to c6. He remembers to follow the opening principles, and here I decided to opt for a move that perhaps is not the most natural. I think that the most natural move is d5, which would be an attempt to win the so-called space advantage. It means that white's pawns are so advanced that they restrict opponent's pieces. Of course, I considered that, and the reason why I didn't like this move is because for this particular moment, opponent's knight finds itself a house on e5. It's a square where the knight is even better placed than it is on c6, and I was afraid that f4 might be already overextending. So maybe white is grabbing more than he could chew. I'm grabbing a lot of territory, but I have army that is undeveloped, and whenever our pawns are pushed forward, we're leaving a lot of weak squares behind them. So with undeveloped army, perhaps I won't be able to cover all of those weaknesses that I have made. For instance, let's imagine the knight drops back to g6 and I just develop normally with knight to f3. Then my opponent can play something like bishop to c5, and the question is, how do I castle in this game? I have lost control over these squares, and winning back those squares might take some time. Yes, there are plans like queen d3 and bishop e3, but first of all, I don't want to develop my queen right now. I want to castle and develop my minor pieces. Also, by definition, my bishop e3 is the good bishop that I have, opposite color to the pawns in the center, and I would not want to exchange my dark square bishop unless I have to. Also, there is a principle that says you should not be exchanging pieces when you have more space. For the same reason, you won't have pieces that defends those holes that you have created previously. So it's not perhaps my cup of tea, and in this game I decided to play knight f3 first. My idea is to get e5 under control and then play the move d5. So now if I play the move d5, there is no opportunity for the knight to land on e5, and so this knight will have to go to squares like a5, e7, b8, all inferior compared to the square on c6. So my opponent here played knight to f6. I want to take a moment here and show you an instructive way perhaps of following this up with black. I think that bishop b4 is correct. Now, white has quite a few ways to block the check. Perhaps knight c3 is one of the most natural ways, developing the knight to absolute best square. And it's true that the pin itself does not prove any harm to white. Black is not threatening to win a piece or a pawn, but by pinning this knight, what black does, it really reduces white's influence over the center, because if the knight can't move right now, it also does not control d5 and e4 right now. So black can take an advantage of that perhaps and try to get the central control back. This is not panacea where black becomes equal, but it's a good attempt to follow black's play that was poor with h6 with a very good break in the center that attempts to equalize in space and central control. So a couple of lines that I could show is c takes d5, and here black takes back, the only move, and we're going to be looking at taking on d5 and pawn to e5. Now, if pawn to e5, then empire of blacks will strike back in the center with f6 very soon. For example, black is developing a piece, white is developing a piece, then black castles, white castles, and black's empire strikes back like in Star Wars movie. So black is attempting to exchange this pawn that is like a dagger in black's position, preventing the black's pieces of finding very good squares in the center, and it also proves to win space for white, and perhaps even white has dreams of kingside attack potential because of that pawn there. So f6 tries to take care of that, and of course if we take, then black can take with the rook and enjoy the open f file. So I feel like after f6 black is almost equal, and I cannot point at the board and say what is white so much better at compared to the black's position. And instead, if we go back and here we decide to take, which may be the best option for white, then white is still of course better here, but at the very least I say that black has an isolated pawn to play against. So maybe bishop e6 or bishop g4, perhaps long castles. White is better, but black is putting up a fight. Now, in our game, black played knight to f6. So this doesn't fight for the center in the similar spirit, and white is executing their idea, or my idea, because I played the game with d5. So now what happens is, because of this move h6, and because white followed this up with very correct play in the center, his pieces cannot find peace in the center, and that's where they're supposed to be. That's the most effective squares for all the minor pieces. So here I'm playing already d5. We took, and black has nowhere to go. Now the best way for black to deal with this would be again to land this check, with the idea that if knight goes back to e7 right now, there is no bishop on fa, that it's blocked there. So for instance, let's say I block with bishop to d2, and my opponent takes, and now knight to e7. That proves to be not already so bad. After a couple of developing moves, if say castles and castles, and imagine white plays rook c1 to put the file on open, put the rook on open file, and black strikes back again, attempting to neutralize white's space advantage. So I guess if you don't take, I take on d5 here, so white is obliged to take, and I'm just giving you an opportunity to visualize how black is taking away white's central control, white's space advantage that they had. So here, okay, bishop e6, knight e5, all sort of those moves I believe are natural, and black has no problems developing, right? Black has a very weak pawn on d6, that is true. On the other hand, e4 can also be a target that black could attack. Otherwise, if we go to e7 compared to not exchanging the bishops, now this bishop, I don't know how to develop it. So here this knight is just in the way of this bishop, and bishop is really not happy. Now in the game, of course, amateurs, they like to make these aggressive moves, and he goes for knight b4. So if my queen is ever starting to wander, he hopes to get this knight c2 fork and win the game. So I'm just developing a piece while defending against a threat. e4 pawn was hanging, and my opponent is pinning the pawn and trying to apply pressure along the e file. Now, if I survive this initiative of blacks, white is strategically winning. You could visualize after a move like e5 under good circumstances, black's pieces will be kicked away to passive squares, and white's pieces are going to take the absolute best squares in the center. You cannot fight such an army. However, I have to make sure I don't lose a pawn in a bad way, I don't lose a piece, and I stop black's initiative eventually. So I'm playing e5, and that's another example of winning space advantage. This knight has no good squares to go to. Now in the game he played knight to h7. We can take a moment to look at what I plan after knight g4. In fact, this pawn is under attack. White could continue with something like bishop f4, but if black is continuing in this crazy spirit, that I assume that g5 would follow, bishop g7, and if white manages to defend everything, as I say, this central control and amazing squares of white pieces, they will give white an objectively winning position. But say if you drop pawn on e5 as white under bad circumstances, then it's possible to lose the game as well. Also, if after something like knight g4 we forget about this knight, we play queen to d4, knight c2, hasta la vista, white loses the game. So you have to be vigilant and just not drop anything under bad circumstances. And the move that I played, I planned to play here was bishop e2. So the idea is that when I bring the rook to e1, it's gonna be mamma mia for black, because the queen and king here on open file are not gonna be happy of blacks. So for instance, my opponent would grab the pawn and already castle. So I'm threatening rook e1, come with all sorts of pins and skewers and discovered attacks, and at the same time knight is hanging. So for instance, you can visualize after taking and taking, there is just absolute no good way to defend against rook e1 and the consequences that are gonna come. For one pawn, white is fully developed, has no weaknesses, almost fully developed, right? Just a couple of pieces left, but I have so many squares that I can choose from. It's just pina coladas. So in the game, maybe that's why the opponent played knight h7 after a long thought, and I'm kicking the other knight, and this is why that move at the start h6 was wrong. So if we come back, of course, white also has to play perfectly, and I'm sure I did not play perfectly, but this is how we punish opponent for playing such moves. We just grab the center, we deploy our pieces in the center where they're very efficient, and our opponent's pieces won't be able to cover those squares. And from here on, the position just plays itself. Bishop c4, we are choosing the best centralized squares, so good. He has to go to the corners. Okay, white is just developing d6. Rook e1. Just look at the development of white. Absolute best squares. 5-star hotels, all included. I think it's called maybe ultra all included, right? There is such a thing where you get everything that you want. So here it's just amazingly easy position to play, and tactics will come very, very soon. Knight takes f3 was played by black. Queen takes f3. He took on e5, and black can be happy for a moment to be a pawn up. White is developing again to absolute best square, and black is unable to take the bishop because the pawn is simply pinned. So what does he do is he plays f6, and for the moment black is a pawn up, but just look at white development and compare it to black's development. King is in the middle, undeveloped, and not clear where they're gonna be developed, not clear how to castle at all. So I was thinking about, of course, queen h5, but as soon as I saw that black can block the check with queen f7, then there is no point in doing that, right? If we swap the queens, then this king is the happiest person on the planet right now. So white says, if I open up the position by the principle, I get tactics to my favor because I'm just way more developed. So white just says you can have it. d6. Now look at what happens after d6. Suddenly my queen is spinning the pawn here, which means that this is a free knight. Or okay, if they take back, I will be taking the rook. Second of all, now if I play queen h5 check, there is no queen f7 block because suddenly my bishop is open and controls this square. 3, I can use d5 square for my knight. 4, I'm opening up the d file and I'm going to be the only controller of that after rook a to d1. So after d6, the position just opens up and all the tactics appear to white's favor. That's it. Black is just lost. So in the game, he tried queen d7. I just took a piece and I'm gonna just show you remaining of the game, which was easy initiative for white. So again, developing pieces are just perfectly placed. That's why I wanted to show you this game. And white now continues with the initiative. Checks, anything that opens up the position, anything that coordinates the pieces. Again, I want to avoid moves like knight a4, no need to go to the corners or make pieces passive if there are no gains there. For instance, queen h5 forces opponent to not castle. That's why we made that check. Now there is a pin along the d file, and my bishop becomes hanging as there is no pin along the e file anymore. So white retreats with the bishop to d7, and now white starts deploying the pieces even onto better squares while creating threats. So here opponent removes the bishop. Now there is another pin along the d file, bishop e6, and slowly the army starts creating threats that are just inevitable. So for example, here I took, and after this discover check, black says enough, let's resign and let's never play h6 ever again. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. You can also consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. That's my full-time job at the moment and for many past years. My contacts are on the right. Thank you very much. Put a comment if you have any questions, and see you in the next video. Bye bye.